Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. This is hopefully you were able to grab something to eat real quick and grab some coffee. We're just going to go through a few things before we get started, and we'll get it. So we're gonna start it like we do our regular podcast. And so, Missy, are you ready?
I am.
All right, cool beans. Welcome to Common Conversations. My name is Miguel Hampton. I am the hostess with the mostest. This is a series on social equity, all the things that we face as people in a common conversation that we have on a day-to-day basis. And this is my co-host,
Missy Smith. Hi, friends.
I love it when she does hi, friends. It's so great. So we've got a good audience and a good guest that are going to come up. And today's conversation is about
the child welfare system
and what we face, what we have to deal with, what resources we have, where they come from, how we manage it, the opinions of the experts in the room, the things that they face on a day-to-day basis, and what we can do different.
Yes, as leaders, and that's why we're excited that you're here. As leaders, what can we all do differently? But before we can even identify that, we have to identify where the opportunities to do better are.
So they're going to have a conversation up here. You'll get to be a part of that as well. Throughout that journey, there'll be some Q&A. There's a microphone back there that if you want to step up and ask a question, you can just shift there, ask the question so that they can hear you when we get through that part. There it is, right? Ready? Get it?
Let's go.
Let's go.
We are Harper Slade LLC, a racial equity advisory firm. We help companies cultivate an environment where Black and brown talent can thrive and transform workplace cultures. With over 20 years' experience in human resources, employment law, and macroeconomics, our goal is to help advance a true commitment to racial equity. Through education programs, racial equity assessments, and advisory services, we're a global leader and are here to help you make a difference. Visit harperslade.com to learn more.
Where you get your drip.
Friends, welcome. We are so excited that you're here, and we're so excited that we're going to be able to have this conversation. And again, this is a discussion, it's a conversation, so please don't feel like you just have to be spectators. We really want to hear from you. I want to bring our amazing panel. So first up, we have Sonja Gray. Sonja Gray is a native of Danville, Kentucky. She studied at the University of Kentucky. As of 2016, she became the first African-American executive director of ECHO, which is Exploited Children's Help Organization. ECHO is dedicated to preventing and reducing the impact and incidences of child abuse by providing education, advocacy, and support services to the children and families of Metro Louisville. Welcome, Sonja. Next up, we have Dr. Anita Barbee. She is a professor and distinguished university scholar and director of the PhD program at the Kent School of Social Work and Family Science at the University of Louisville. She's worked in the field of child welfare for 30 years. She and her collaborators helped to install and evaluate the solution-based casework practice. These models shifted child welfare practice to be less punitive, more family-centered, engaging, and trauma-informed, and culturally sensitive. Welcome, Dr. Barbee. And last but definitely not least, we have Adria Johnson. Adria Johnson has focused her career on lifting some of society's most vulnerable populations and being of service to others. She is a dedicated and well-respected servant leader. Ms. Johnson's proven ability to lead efforts toward reform and work collaboratively across a wide range of stakeholders have served her well, not only in her current position of Chief Executive Officer for Metro United Way, but also in prior roles held with the Kentucky State Government and Louisville Metro. Ms. Johnson has stood at the forefront and led and supported efforts aimed at addressing racial disparities and equity concerns found within the population served in child welfare. Welcome, Adria. So friends, we know why we're here, and again, we've had this discussion, and I feel like if we just would have had a microphone then and a camera, we would have been golden. But let's share with everyone what we have found in our discussions. So I think the first thing we need to do is really, can we define the child welfare system, what we mean by that, and what programs we are talking about when we identify those systems?
Would you like me to start? So the hat that I wore before I stepped in as CEO of Metro United Way was commissioner on the Kentucky side for Department of Community-Based Services, which people know is synonymous with CPS, DCBS. Child welfare, the child welfare system was, obviously foster care, adoption. There is a judicial side to child welfare. There is a community-based serving side of child welfare, and so it really is a holistic system.
Wonderful, thank you. And one of the things that I was really hoping you would give us is, I know that you're speaking from Kentucky, but this isn't different in Indiana. Can you name the life of a report? So what we know in that system is that someone is making a report into a hotline, and can you tell us kind of what happens from that point?
Yeah, so if there is suspicion, allegation of abuse or neglect, somebody does exactly what you just said. They call the hotline. Those on the receiving end of the hotline obviously are assessing what is being presented by the person making the report and making some determinations on whether or not that warrants investigation. And there are practice guidelines that govern that work, and so what they're looking for in making that determination of whether or not it warrants investigation. If it does not, they still may refer that, look at that case and see if it warrants some referral for some community supports or some intervention in a different way, but it doesn't necessarily rise to the occasion of needing state attention. Now, if the person on the receiving end of the hotline, based on what is being presented, feels like it does warrant investigation, then that's exactly what happens, right? They're going to investigate what the allegations are of abuse or neglect, and then there is going to be a determination made of whether or not there is evidence to substantiate those allegations of abuse or neglect, or if that is unsubstantiated. And so if it's substantiated, that means that there is believed to have been some, there is believed to have been abuse or neglect. If that is the case, then they are assessing for the immediate safety of the child. So that's where the case determinations are made as to whether or not, that child is at imminent risk of harm, whether there's an immediate removal needed, whether or not that child needs to come into state's custody, and if so, if the decision is made that they need to come into state's custody and can't remain at home, then the placement decision needs to be made on whether or not that child is going to go into a foster care setting, whether or not that child has, more severe concerns that may warrant placement in a residential setting. And so then, from there, because at that point, if the child is actually being brought into state's custody, then the case is opened. And so it goes from an investigative case to an ongoing case. And, that, depending on what is presenting and what the case plan is for that child and that family, then decisions are made as to whether or not the goal becomes return to parent, whether the goal becomes the permanency goal, let me say that. So a permanency goal is established. The permanency goal may be return to parent, maybe that adoption is needed, right? And so that is the life cycle from a report to a case. And the ultimate goal is permanency. Again, permanency depending on what is presenting in the case.
Thank you so much for that. Now, this project that
Can
Miguel
I just
and I
add one more
Oh,
thing?
of
I'm
course you
sorry.
can.
No, I'm sorry. I
you're
didn't mean to
fine.
interrupt you. But I think it's important because when I sat in that seat, what I found, and yes, there are incidences of children and young people that are victims of physical and sexual abuse, but that is a much smaller number. That is the minority. The vast majority of children that come into state's care are due to other factors, and a lot of it's rooted in poverty, a lot of it's rooted in family instability, and so it's environmental neglect. There's a whole conversation that we could have around, in my opinion, the need to shift the system in a way that really places more supports for community and prevention, because to have to come into state's custody, especially for environmental factors, again, sexual and physical abuse are something very different. You've got a child that is in harm, right, being physically or sexually harmed. But for situations where, the family is in struggle and just can't provide, and that is creating these challenges, in my opinion, it's unfortunate that we're not structured in a way that allows for more preventive resource to flow into communities.
And that actually leads beautifully into kind of where I want to go next. The entire point of our project is to speak on equity and how we can bring equity into all of the systems that affect our communities. And we deeply believe that when community leaders find these, learn truths that they may not have access to, that they'll want to do better and want to pour into systems and projects that would make our community more equitable. So one of the foundations of our project is we believe people have to tell themselves a story about their community to feel like their community is a just and good place. And I feel like working in the child welfare system for 20 years that one of the stories that people believe is that children who come into the system, they do so because they truly need it, and it is an equitable system. That, someone goes in and makes a decision based only on the facts of the case. I would love to know what you all know as the truth behind that fairy tale that we tell.
Can I speak to that? I'm ready. There is disproportionality of who comes into the system, who's called on, so that Black, brown families, African American, Latina, Native American, are much more likely to have a call come in, much more likely once the call happens to be substantiated, much more likely once there's a substantiation to be placed in out-of-home care with stranger care rather than kin care, more likely to languish in the system for a long time, and less likely to be adopted. So there's a disproportionality thing. Now, if you really look at our communities, where the way this whole thing was set up was inequitable from the beginning, and afraid of a small number of batterings that happen that kill a small number of children. And it's not that any death of a child is not important, but if it's like a needle in the haystack, if there's 1,700 deaths nationally in a year, here's what we do to try to find that needle. Think of a funnel. You've got 4 million calls about a family representing 7 million children. Those are the calls that come in nationally. This is 2020. This is a low year. Half of those cases are ruled out. It doesn't go to investigation. That's about 4 million children, though, their families do get called, investigated, 2 million families. Of those, only 400,000 are found to be substantiated. 10% of the original number of cases, 600,000 children. And 60% of those are neglect. So only about 200,000 cases is it sexual abuse or physical abuse, which does need to be attended to. And then again, a very small number, 0.0002%, die at the hands of parents. So we've set up a system where we're scraping and surveilling lots of families. A third of families in America, a third of children, by the time they reach 18, this is all families, will have a call to the hotline about their family by the time the child is 18. Over 50% of Black children will have an investigation. That means more have been called in. Almost all Black families get tugged into this system. So we're surveilling. It's a police state, just like the police roaming a neighborhood, looking for trouble. And again, we say to ourselves, it's because children need to be safe. But what we're not saying to ourselves, like many countries around the world, is how do we make sure that children have well-being and thrive and become the best person that they can in their life? And that means supporting families, because children love their families, even if the families have issues, and they want to be with their families. And we've done some truth-telling circles in the last year with young people who have gone to the foster care system, and every one of them said, even though they were in dire poverty and dire straits, and their mama might have had a addiction problem, which is an illness, by the way, not something to be punished, but treated. And they said, I'd rather be with my mama, who I knew loved me, even in those circumstances, than pulled out and put into homes where people don't love me and often abused and neglected in that system. Not everybody is. Our systems try really hard not to make that happen. But the point is, too much surveillance, too many people coming in. It is inequitable. And so we need to figure out a way to reframe the whole system so that the families that need the help, whether it be for poverty or mental health or other kinds of struggles that they're having parenting, are given support rather than something must be wrong and we're looking for abuse. And so that's my main point for the day, and everybody else can talk from now on.
I love that. I think one of the things for me, when I first entered into this space, and we're going to be throwing out a lot of statistics and a lot of numbers, but I was just in a panel discussion the other night, and a lot of numbers, a lot of statistics, and as I walked out of there, I had to be reminded, when we're talking about statistics, remember these are people. These are children that we're talking about. One of the first things that was quite amazing to me is the amount of calls that come into CPS, and whether it's substantiated or unsubstantiated, most of those calls were about white children. But then when I looked at the numbers for foster care, the higher numbers of kids that are in foster care were African American kids or kids of color. And I was trying to have someone make that make sense to me. I don't understand how can we have these two different types of statistics. And it goes back to systems, how systems were put up, how systems were formed, how they were developed, how they were put in place to continually marginalize the individuals that may not have the same resources as others. So when you really think about it, in systems, you have to think about the state of America for brown and black people. And there was nothing that was really created in order for us to progress or to really, what I would say, conquer. And so as we look at the systems and how and I'm a firm believer, if you see something, do something. I always say you never know if you're going to be that child's saving grace. So we still want individuals to make sure that they are reporting. But at the same token, when we make those reports, I think it's important that we all have biases, but when you are in a position where you are making a determination for a family and for a child, we really need a lot more education around that. We need to really understand about cultural differences and cultural likeness. We also need to understand that abuse does not equal poverty. Many of our brown and black families are in poverty not because they wanted to be there, but because the system put them there.
Would you expand on that last statement? Because I think that is so, so important. So poverty does not equal abuse. And yet, so many of the calls that come in are about environmental neglect, basically because the child's in poverty. So let's speak to that. Let's speak to what people are seeing, what they're calling on, and what's truly appropriate in that space.
So one example that I give in a training is that if you was to walk into a household, mother, father, caregiver, whomever it may be, and you see a child that is sleeping on the floor, would you consider that abuse? And of course, I get mixed answers. Some are yes, some are no. And then I always ask them to explain to me their answer. And specifically, if it's yes, that's the eye-opening as to why you think it's abuse. And some of it's miseducation. Some of it can be, this is just what I know because I know every child should have a bed. And if they're not sleeping in a bed, then that parent must be abusing them. But really, the fact is that comes in with cultural differences, because the role of a parent or a caregiver under Kentucky's law are the fundamental rights, the right to have adequate food and shelter and schooling and medication. So if that parent still has a loving environment, but yet may not be able to afford a bed, but has the blankets on the floor and the pillows and whatever it can make it nice, or sleeping on the couch or whatever, and she's still making sure that her child is fed and going to school, and she's there at those PTA meetings and things of that nature, then that is not abuse. But then I give them another scenario. What if the child is on the floor and then the home is infested with insects? Now that is abuse, because it's not a safe environment for any child to live in. So that's just one of those examples that I really try to get people to thinking, what is the difference between what abuse really looks like and then what is poverty? Poverty is just a factor that you do not have all the resources that some others may have, but it does not mean that you're abusing your children.
But can I,
Yeah, I was
reflecting on that second example, because, it's just ironic that we're having this conversation today. We had a staff retreat yesterday, and I talked to my staff about why I do this work. And one of the things that I shared with them was, when I was growing up, my family and I experienced poverty. And one of the things that I shared with them was the conditions that we found ourselves living in at one point in our lives. Had CPS been triggered, I guarantee you they would have intervened, because we did have the roaches, we did have the mice. I do not think that is abusive. I think what needs to happen is the family needs to be supported to find adequate housing, but I would not define that as abuse, because I certainly would not have said that my mother was abusing me and my brothers, because the circumstance that she found herself in resulted in us living in those conditions. And it was not because she was a neglectful parent. It was because she was a parent that couldn't afford more at the time. There is a huge difference. We stigmatize, we penalize. I mean, the list goes on, and what that does to a parent that's already struggling to now be made to even feel more inadequate. They already feel inadequate because I can't provide for my child. Now, if you're really not providing for your child because you are motivated by something that is abusive and neglectful, because you're just choosing to not try and create that home environment, you're choosing to not create that stability and nurturing that children need, that's a whole nother camp. But that's just not that's not the case for the majority of what I've seen, sitting in the seats that I've seen and my own lived experience. And like I mentioned earlier, it's unfortunate because the systems, even when you think about the resources that flow into states to support child welfare, the vast majority of the dollars, we've had Family First legislation, which was wonderful. It was the most sweeping legislation child welfare has experienced in decades, but it's not enough. Because even now, it did do some wonderful things. It centered parents into having more of a voice in the care and the care plan for their child. It really challenges the use of residential care so that children don't linger in those more restrictive settings. And it did allow for some additional funding toward preventive measures, but not to the degree that's needed. The vast majority of the funds that flow into a state are to provide room, board, and maintenance, and watchful oversight. And that's a whole nother conversation. But that's how the dollars flow. And so, you've got states that are struggling, to adequately resource, the supports that communities need. And so it just becomes this vicious cycle. And you've got all of us out here fighting the good fight, continuing to put Band-Aids on things when there's wide-scale reform that's needed that perpetuates all of this. So that's.
Yeah, the other piece of this is, whose fault is it that there's roaches? Say you're in an apartment complex. Why are we looking at the family? Why aren't we looking at the landlord who owns the building, who's not making sure things are clean? Or why, if we have rights to housing and food and all these things, then why don't we make sure everybody pays their taxes so that we have the resources to have housing and other kinds of resources for families so that they can help their children thrive? I feel like it's a societal mark against us as a society, not families. Instead of looking at them, we need to look at each other and say, why aren't we fighting in the streets for more resources for families to be able to thrive? So,
thank you so much, and I completely agree with that. Now, in those cases, so let's say that you have a family who, again, if we believe that parents wake up every day and say, I want to do the best for my family, again, 20 years in this system, can't imagine a situation where I felt a mom woke up and said, I want to be as bad a parent as I possibly can to this child. So if we believe that parents want to do the best that they can, a hallmark of what we believe in this project is that communities want to do the best that they can. So how do we make change? What is the change that is needed to shift our focus rather than the penalization, rather than the over-surveillance of communities? And I do want to come back to that we need to speak to a prevention model. In Indiana, there are prevention dollars. Now, again, they are much less than the intervention dollars. They're a very small portion of the money that flows in for child welfare. And those dollars are dedicated to two spaces. The Healthy Families Program, which is for children who are, either mom is prenatal or up to 90, the baby is less than 90 days old, and then they can have support through the first 3 to 5 years of their life. And it's a voluntary program. It's a beautiful and amazing thing. I only am a little biased because I was the program manager right until recently. So I've deeply loved that program. And we have community partners, which pours into older children. So until the child is 17, or when a child is 17, they are no longer eligible for that program, but it's those places that you were supposed to call, that we have bugs and we don't know what to do. We have issues and we don't know what to do. But again, the money is so small. It was the case that you used to be able to call community partners in Clark County and say, we have bed bugs, and you would be able to get that help. I have not found that to be the case now, that you can call. So what do we do as a system? What do you suggest?
I mean, I think it goes back to what Sonja and I were talking about at the table briefly. It really is rooted in, there has to be policy change, right? I mean, like, if to ever get to the place of having adequate resources, it's got to be policy change. And one thing I would be remiss if I didn't say, this is not an assault on the workforce. I mean, it is a thankless field. Child welfare is a thankless field. People have a lot of assumptions. The social workers that do this work, they're very much underappreciated. I would venture to say very much undercompensated. And so they are working within a system that was designed to work the way it works, right? So I need to be very clear in saying that I believe that those workers wake up just as we described that mother, with the intent to not do harm. They are trying to do their best in working on behalf of the family and the child, but they're just limited in the ability to do what they can do. And so it starts with the advocacy piece. And so it really, you've got to get out and educate and try and empower and help people understand what the necessity of raising their voice with their elected officials. I mean, that is what it is going to take en masse to have enough of a swell that it forces people to stand up and take and give some attention to these issues. I don't know how you ever really affect change without that component, because it is dependent on resources. You've got to have resources to shift the paradigm.
I love the fact that you mentioned that the systems is working exactly as it was intended to. And I want to come back to the foundation of what that system, where it started. And if you build something on a broken foundation, can it ever truly be fixed? So what do we need to do with that? We only have an hour, so we're going to do a lot of talking. But I want to say, I feel like people want to do their best, but they don't know how to advocate. So if they were to raise their voice with their lawmakers, what do they need to say? What do they do? What do they promote when they make those phone calls?
I want to go back to the prevention side because we didn't talk enough about that.
I agree.
So ECHO, fortunately enough, we've been around since 1983. We're actually celebrating 40 years, and that is part of one of the pillars that we stand on is prevention education. And so several years back, I started asking the question about stranger danger. How many of us have grown up with stranger danger and have known that? Then I started really asking from generation to generation, and it was very eye-opening to myself that program, which was a preventative program for children, to be able to identify someone that they did not know, and stranger danger. But that program has not been in the school system for over 10 years. And so I started sitting back and thinking, well, what are we doing even with our kids? Our first advocacy and having individuals to speak up are children. And so, as Adria said, is that we really need to work with our legislative individuals. And so I have been voicing that we need to create some type of prevention education plan inside the schools with the kids, so that they know what to look out for, what are the red flags, when to speak up, who to speak up to, and then also knowing that it's not their fault. There's no blame and there's no shame when it comes to their safe and healthiness as well. So within the last year, I bravely started the advocacy plan as well, because for most of us, if this is not something that you saw from your family or you went to school for, people say use your voice, but many times it's how do I use it and where do I use it? Who do I get to, whose office do I sit in that's really going to hear me as well? Not just me speaking, but it's going to hear what we're really talking about. And so within this last year, I've really been striving to work with our legislative individuals in Frankfort to ask them what they think about child abuse prevention education, and why do we not have something in our schools that is first educating our young kids about their public right and safety, and then secondly, also talking with the families and the adults, but then teaching them once again how to advocate, how to use their voice, and how to be heard.
Can I just add practical things, because you're right. The political system is overwhelming. People that just are living their daily lives. People are busy, people are consumed. You see the general election for the president, you see it for the governor. You need to be paying attention to your local election. So the first thing is people need to understand every position that requires a vote, right? So it is your council members, it is your judges, and so that's step one, some just good old fashioned, let me understand who my elected officials are, and then for you individually, what district am I in? So who is my council member at a city level? Who is my state elected official? Who is my congressman at a national level? Those are the names of the people that you are their constituent. So one, you need to know who those individuals are. You have the right to reach out to them. And even if you don't exactly know what to say, I want some time to meet with you and I want to talk about these issues. Because from there, that can spur some additional conversation. It can spur some additional questions. You don't have to go alone. Grab your neighbor, grab your family. But it starts with you knowing, who do I even need to talk to? And that is Googleable, if that's even a word. That is information that you can find on any website. Who's my council person? Who's my state representative? Who's my congressional representative?
And I want to also speak, you mentioned the board. The school board is instrumental in that as well.
Yes.
Very much so.
What we have found in many school systems, many school boards.
Number one reporter.
The schools are the number one reporter, but there isn't that program that can speak to child safety. I assumed there was, again, just assuming the best about my community. When my daughter was in kindergarten, I said, so who's going to come and speak about body safety? And who's going to speak about, how to keep her safe? And they said, well, we don't have that program. We don't have ECHO in the schools in Indiana, and we desperately need that. But school boards are also being infiltrated by people who refuse to speak about things like social emotional learning, who refuse to speak about anything that is not reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that advocacy and that knowledge is so important, because how are we going to advocate for ECHO to come in and give this curriculum and give this training if we're not allowed to speak about emotions and our social learning?
The other piece that we need to be advocating for is a change in how child abuse and neglect are defined. So in every state statutes, it will say, if you're houseless, that is neglect. That is not true. And so there needs to be kind of a combing through all that legislation to say separate out what is poverty that needs to be taken care of by community and what is actual neglect, intentional neglect, as well as physical and sexual abuse, which always need to be on the table for mandated reporters. The second thing is we need universal help for families. So instead of stigmatizing, some families need help when they have a baby in their first 5 years of raising them. Again, other countries, every parent gets someone to come in and teach them how to lactate and build a bond, and they have time off from work that they can go back to that job once they've spent the first year with their child. All of those kinds of policies that are family friendly and that support all families, you'll get more traction because then something's in it for everybody, rather than whenever we say these people over here need something, we're much more likely to say, well, I'm not one of those, so I'm not going to worry. So if we universalize those kinds of systems of supports, just like the medical system, everyone, well, everybody didn't get insurance, but, most people, see themselves as needing that at some point. We need to put that in the social side, and then we're much more likely to have the traction, I think.
And I love that you said that, because as we're talking about universal learning, that's where that stranger danger comes in. How was it universal that all kids knew about that? Going back to your point about the learning for kids, as you all can tell, I'm all about my alley with kids here. And I'm so fortunate to sit on the panel with these two experts as well. And then if they're not learning, then they're going to be targeted and labeled. And then once they are labeled, then it's going to be challenges after challenges after challenges. Even when they're going to try to rise to the top because they've been labeled, then they may not be able to have those same opportunities as others or other resources and things of that nature. So for me, it is a universal learning for all of our children, and it does impact their educational learning as well. If you do not feel safe or if you have been abused, how do you expect me to sit in a classroom, pay attention, learn, and then regurgitate the information that you are sending to me when I know that at the end of the day, I may not have food, I may get yelled at, I may be beat on. It supersedes everything else when it comes to education. And education is very important, but we also must understand that health and safety of children is also important and a priority in order for them to be in those spaces to learn.
Thank you. So we have touched on, I don't feel like we've gone deep enough yet. We've touched on many, many things. So I'm curious what questions we have for the panel and for each other. So let's take a few minutes to talk to each other, talk amongst one another. You have cards on your table if you have some questions as things arise. I would love for you all to hear from each other and then for us to hear from you too.
We are Harper Slade LLC, a racial equity advisory firm. We help companies cultivate an environment where Black and brown talent can thrive and transform workplace cultures. With over 20 years experience in human resources, employment law, and macroeconomics, our goal is to help advance a true commitment to racial equity. Through education programs, racial equity assessments, and advisory services, we're a global leader and are here to help you make a difference. Visit harperslade.com to learn more.
Start it up.
called Family Preservation of Indiana. We have been to Frankfurt talking to senators, trying to make change. Everything you spoke of today is what concerns us. I would have never been involved in this except my my grandchildren were removed from their parents. And the Family First Act never came forward. You know, I was never contacted. CPS refused to talk to me. They locked me out. It was a maternal family. Maternal family got my children, but they had never had any relationship with these children. The children were 9, 10, and 15. They had nothing to do with these children their whole entire life where I took care of them. I had the children when the allegations came in. They were in my custody for 3 months. No one contacted me. The other grandmother came down from upstate, said, "Can I take the kids to lunch?" And sure, you know. So I let her take them to lunch. Well, instead, I come to find out 2 weeks later, they went to an interview, the initial interview, and placed them immediately into the custody of this grandmother, yet she dropped them back off to me for 2 weeks, which is against the law. So we're trying to change that too. These hearings are supposed to be held within 72 hours. Everything was going fine. I intervened, went to court to intervene to get guardianship of these children. They tried to deny me visits as a grandmother. 4 months afterwards, this family member, the whole entire time, they were alienating me from the children, trying not to they didn't follow judge's orders. They followed an allegation. Then their next step was to file allegations against me. First time unsubstantiated. Anyway, they did it 3 times, and each time unsubstantiated, but that caused me to lose the relationship with their mother had deceased. They just had a single father for 4 years, and I stepped in as mother and took care of these children. But after these 3 unsubstantiated allegations in which CPS never even talked to me or questioned me about, I'm not even allowed, and I wasn't even allowed visitation. Grandparents have no visitation rights. So these laws need changing. So anyway, my point is, I'm with the Family Preservation of Indiana. I do have pamphlets I can pass out. All my goals are the same as yours. And we also have a group in Kentucky. You can find both of us on Facebook. And I will pass these out to anyone that wants to get involved with us.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
I was just going to say, she speaks to another point is, if you've had, remember those 7 million children, those 4 million families that have been called in? That's in the record. It never leaves the record that you've ever had a call. So when the next call comes, they look to see there's been a call before. Now, it was unsubstantiated, but you're still in the system. And so those things start to add against you because people wonder, well, if somebody's calling, even if it's about poverty or some other issue, then something must be wrong. So we have no way to expunge all that record that people are accumulating. And that's a law that could change. Certainly if there's been a substantiation, you want some information, but to stay forever and to follow people is part of the thing that she's mentioned. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're fine. I think it's touching me what you said about being a grandmother. Just a little of my background history. I did have a single parent mother, and I had a wonderful grandmother. And at the point in time when I was growing up, I had 3 first cousins, and they were living with my grandmother. Now, me being who I am and loving my grandmother, I was quite jealous that my, first cousins were living with my grandparents. But once again, I was in a time frame where adult matters stayed in adult spaces. And so never really knew exactly why they were there until I got older and understanding that I had an aunt that was on drugs. And at that point in time, it was the best place for my cousins to be with my grandparents. Now, ironically enough, I never had any type of interaction with CPS or anything of that nature, but I think once again, when we're looking at systems and we're looking at who are the best people for children, we really need to support family members that are stepping up to the plate to take on someone else's children and raising them. And not only that they're stepping up to the plate, but we also need to make sure that we're providing that support that they are going to need. In the past several years, we've noticed a high percentage of grandparents raising grandkids that may not even have grandkids, children in their household for over 10 or 15 years. And now all of a sudden they have 2 and 3-year-olds and they're trying to navigate, this process and this system. And how do I get resources and where do I get resources? And I'm not familiar with the internet and how to, I need to go here, I need to go there. So we need to provide support services for family members that are stepping up to keep family within the family. And secondly, we need to make it easy to navigate to be able to provide those resources that they are needing. So if we cannot, if we are unable to just send someone to a website and you're unfamiliar with that, then we need to start meeting them where they are and making sure that they know that those resources are there. So I commend you, but as Dr. Anita said, once you get in that system, it's really hard to get out of that system. And then once again, there's this face that is created about who you are without even really knowing about who you are.
And I think it's so important to point out that the system that you're suggesting, that providing support, providing information, parenting advice to those older adults who are raising children now, that doesn't exist, at least in Indiana. That once you place with kinship, they're like, and good luck. Because they're so overwhelmed and their caseloads are such that they have, well, you're in a safe place. Good luck. The fact that that doesn't exist is hugely problematic.
Can I speak into that?
Please.
So my name is Ann Carruthers. I actually was an investigator for child abuse in Indiana, worked for the Department of Child Services, and obviously it launched a great career for me in that we've been a resource for parents as they have been identified as higher need families. Our ideology and framework in which we do all our work is prevention. Because when we would get into those homes, we would find solutions for the family. There's a lot going on in Kentucky, but in Indiana, we work with Department of Child Services very closely, and that they call us now for a resource to stop the negative trajectories.
No, I that's why I said what I said earlier about the workforce. Make no mistake, you have the Anns of the world that, yes, that are working their hardest to keep families preserved, to do preventive measures. It's a resource issue. There are policy change issues. There are law issues.
And I think the other thing that we definitely want to bring light that you said, this is not a shame on workers. We're talking about systems. What the structure that has been put in place for these individuals to work by. So we know that there are many CPS workers and social workers that go above and beyond, but sometimes they are still limited in what they are able to really do to provide that support, that humanity support that comes from them for a grandparent or for a parent that may have been in the system and is just really trying to realign their lives again. So we're talking about things that have been already established that unfortunately sometimes is a little tough to try to work around or work by and things like that. So thank you, Ms. Ann, for that. Appreciate that.
And I think we have to ask a question that why was it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if we had issues with something like bed bugs, if we had issues with food or even cleaning supplies, that we had a program we could call and they said, we got you, we can do this. Now you call that same program and they'll be like, oh, we don't do that. Because it's a contracting, different agency, all that. But the questions are, where did those resources go? And why did those resources shift away from families? And if we're advocating, and our lawmakers hopefully are going to watch this and listen to this, where'd that money go? Just saying. Mahogany?
Greetings, everyone. My name is Mahogany Livers. I'm the Director of Programming with Play Cousins Collective in Louisville, Kentucky. Yay! Our mission is to build a village around our children, and so that looks like preparing our children for the world, but also preparing the world for our children. So this advocacy work is definitely in alignment with what we're doing in the conversation we're having today. I have a few points. I wrote them down, y'all, so bear with me. A couple questions. So feel free to pause me or respond however you want. But my first question is, how do we see, and I don't know everything, so if there's already something in place, we can also talk about that. But really, to your point about the disproportion that's in the system already, like how do we ensure that there is addressing of that cultural competency part? Because if we're saying that there's a lot of Black and brown children that are being affected by this, and knowing where they come from, knowing how their environment may or may not look, and having that approach of let's dive deeper into that, even from the parents' childhood, right? And how they got there, what systems are they have fell into. And most of the time it is career poverty, just finances. And once you're in the hole, it's so hard to get out of. And so with that also, if we think about the mindset of the parents that are getting into these systems, in our experience, we work a lot with families and mothers with children under 5. And so recently, just last week, we had a parent that came to us and was saying that, they want to get a job, but they have to put their child in childcare, right? And so they also have their circumstances where they might not have the cleanest clothes, right? Or looking the freshest or smelling the freshest. And so that is going to arise concern, right? Or they may have experiences when they were little where that happened with them. And so they don't want to put their child in childcare, which means they can't get a job. And so now they're stuck, right? So how do we address some of those, I think like someone else said, redefining what abuse and neglect look like and getting in front of that, like where childcare centers should have resources to where if you don't have clean clothes, we have a closet, right? So getting in front of that instead of responding and checking in more intentionally, right? Also, because like I said, with Play Cousins, we do focus on the Black community and those that are either raising Black children or have Black children of their own. And so with that, how can we as Play Cousins or other organizations that are grassroots become a catalyst where we can be a part of that prevention? I heard you mention like prevention and intervention dollars. Like how is that system regulated to where we can slide in there, right? Because it's probably on the hush-hush where if you already there for the last 45 years, then you're still there and we're not going to change it because they don't think the system's broke, so why change it, right?
Well, because it's working like it was supposed to.
There is a race child welfare group that advocates
Race
for
Community Child Welfare,
Thank you.
RCCW.
RCCW.
I can get you some information.
Yeah. And so the community can say, where are the numbers and are they getting better and what are y'all doing system-wide? It's not just bias within the mind of a worker, which happens a lot of it is we don't have like blind reviews. There's all kinds of things you can put in place to prevent some of that from happening, but it takes sometimes that external agitation of saying, where are your numbers and how can we jump in and open up to the rest of us and not just...
That's what I was going to say. I mean, when I was commissioner and we started to really pour into this, it was on the heels of some juvenile justice legislation that had been passed. There was a Juvenile Justice Oversight Council that was formed, and it was made up of a variety of different agencies that served this population. And one of the things that we did, which raised awareness to what we were dealing with, was to disaggregate our data by race. And that's when we really began to see the disproportionality, and that forced the objective conversation, like take the emotion out of it. What is the data telling us? And then we have a responsibility to respond and do something about that. Because when you know that kids of a certain race, Black kids, are lingering in care, they're not being adopted, they're more likely to be in restrictive settings. And oh, by the way, even the implicit bias comes in because even the calls that come in present as more violent, more concerning versus white counterparts where it's characterized differently. So it really has to become a community education effort around a variety of stakeholders. Mandatory reporting and understanding why you need to do, what constitutes a mandatory report. Everybody's a mandatory reporter, by the way, everybody. Everybody has a responsibility to report an allegation of abuse or neglect. But for the systems, schools, law enforcement, this cultural competence. I mean, even the social work staff, right? The ones that are doing the practice, you have to start unpacking how is the implicit bias that everybody has. We all have implicit bias. We are all shaped by our conditions, how we're raised, who we are, but how is that impacting how you go about the practice? And so you become more conscientious, and change happens when you recognize how you are being triggered by certain words, certain things, and how you might want to step back and, reconsider some things. I'll give you an example. Like when we started to open this up, we started to even pull in our child serving agencies and really like, how are you all being culturally competent with the young people in your care? And then we started to pull in panels of young people that had aged out of the system, because then we could, have them talk to us as adults. And I mean, they were sharing some things like, when I was in a residential center, I got penalized because I don't wash my hair every day. Newsflash, most Black people don't wash their hair every day. I mean, we don't. I mean, but again, unless you understand that as a child serving agency and a staff member working there, again, it's not intentional. I'm asking you to be compliant with the guidelines that are in our serving agency, right? I don't know that that's not part of how you care for yourself and your body, because that's not my culture. So we've just got to, one, be humble enough, right? Like set the ego aside. We have to be, let me step back. We have to be willing to actually look at what the data is telling us. Because I'm going to tell you, that's not easy in state systems, right? And some legitimacy with some capacity constraint, other motivation. Some people don't want to see what the data tells them, right? But we need to push for that. We need to demand for that, right? So there has to be the will to really have an objective lens to what are the outcomes of the system that we are responsible for administering? And if there are people that are not achieving the same outcomes, then we have a responsibility to ask the hard questions around why, and to be willing to do what it takes to change that. And so that's, again, the training, the education.
And have parent partners. We have CASA for the children as advocates, but we don't have a system-wide group of people who are advocating for the parents in the larger family. And so it's very imbalanced. I'm not against children being advocated for, but again, they are happiest within their family. So that's another piece that I feel like you can really bring. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you.
Oh, no, you're fine. I think it's supposed to be organic. Yeah. First off, I want to say, Play Cousins, you are a catalyst, okay? So, yeah, you are part of the prevention. We have worked with you all very closely. I'm going to be very real, and I know it's being taped and things like that, so, But actually, we need to invest into preventative programs. We are a very reactive nation. We wait till something happens, and then we scurry around and we pull all this money from somewhere that we didn't have before, that we've been asking for, in order for this not to happen. And so prevention, education, a lot of times, because once again, and I'm very fortunate to have one of my past staff members here, Leanne. She knows as well as I know, looking for prevention dollars is like searching for a needle in a haystack. There are many organizations that recognize that we do need to put dollars toward preventative measures in order to change the needle. But there are so many more dollars on the other side. And I'm not saying that we need to take anything away, but we need to diversify that in order to really see a major change. Really got to start with prevention, education, talking to families about how to prevent some of these occurrences from happening, so that we don't see the reactive piece of it, where a parent's in a system and then they're looking for resources and they can't do that, and then they can't get the job because they don't have the daycare dollars, or they don't have the clothes because they don't know how to connect to Dress for Success or something to that nature. So you are a catalyst, but we really need to look into investing more into the prevention, with the knowledge knowing that we're not going to have measurable outcomes that are going to come within a month. Okay? It's not going to happen in a month, because a lot of times when you're doing prevention work, it took us a long time to get in this space, so it's going to take us a long time to get out of the space.
add something? Just that I also think, I mean, like, we all love Play Cousins for all the reasons that you guys are just incredible. You do have that cultural sensitivity because you represent who you serve. So also for those in the preventive space or whatever space they're in, to center people with lived experience in shaping how your organization serves is critical. Because you can be the most well-intentioned organization on the planet, but if you are staffed and informed by people that can't relate or haven't taken the time to educate themselves on how to relate, then you're also perpetuating this cycle because you're engaging and you're introducing strategies and approaches that just may not have the same ability to be as successful because you don't have the relevance to the very population that you're trying to serve. It matters who sits in these seats.
Yes.
That is why the push for diversity, because if I've never been poor, if I've never been a grandparent that has intersected with the system or whatever the case may be, I am going to be more ill-equipped to be as adequate in solving for something because I just can't relate. It is not personal, I just can't relate. If I've never had a certain condition, who am I to inform on how to treat that condition? Or at least ask someone that has.
And I think that, so you've said two things that I really want to touch on and remind people, again, the change makers and the people who have an ability to make change, that number one, your policies need to be examined for inequity. And you're setting people up for failure because it's often, if those who write the policies are part of the dominant culture, they're writing those policies for the dominant culture. And you need to have people sitting at the table on your board. You need to have people sitting on advisory committees that can speak to experience, lived experience, and how these systems really work, because we believe from the outside we have an idea of how they work, and those sitting in executive spaces, they're like, this is how it's supposed to work. And they make the assumption that it is working that way. So let's look at what's really happening.
Experiences are important. You wanted to say something
I
else?
just say
'Cause you've got
one
so
more
many
thing.
things.
It was
Please
just
do.
maybe two more things.
Yeah, please.
I guess my last question, and then I'll sit down. But as far as like the life of the report, right? What is the circumstances usually when those cases remain open or get closed, right? And what are some of the outcomes or things that happen that make them be closed or remain open?
Well, I mean, any case, again, is
And
going to have
thank
a
y'all for your
permanency
answer.
goal, right? And that's hard to say because every case is unique. But ultimately, a case is going to be closed if the goal is return to family, when that family has been reunified, right? Or if it's the goal, if it's a permanency goal in adoption, the case will close when that child has been able to find that forever home. And that's, that can be, much longer than anyone would like. I mean, I will tell you, I used to follow, when I headed the system in Kentucky, it was something called a statewide foster care facts. It's published every month for every region in Kentucky, published statewide, and I would look at just different things. How many kids are in care, how many are in a residential setting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there were two things that always really, really bothered me. And one, stat that I paid attention to was how many moves had they experienced on average, right? Because oftentimes it's more than anybody would like. It's enough that you have to come into state's custody and go into a foster care home and again, people that are willing to open up their homes to be nurturing and stabilizing for children are also to be applauded. I mean, our foster parent system is very much needed. We don't always have an adequate number of culturally responsive homes, right, to meet the diversity that is often in the child welfare population. But I would pay attention to moves, and then we also had a stat that was average percent of life in care. And so the average percent of any child's life, regardless of their age, had they spent in care, and it hovered around 2.5 to 3 years. That's heartbreaking for me to think that regardless of whether your goal is return to parent or to be adopted, that, if I'm a 3-year-old, that means a third of my life has been spent in care. If I'm 10, that means 3.5. I mean, like, that in and of itself should convict everybody to want to overhaul the system, because that is traumatizing.
Yes, yes.
It is, there is no other word you can use for it. It is traumatizing for all involved. And so, yeah, but in terms of what it takes to close it, it is all dependent on that permanency goal. And that permanency goal and how quickly that gets closed. You know, if it's return to parent, then there are things the parent is working on. You know, the conditions, you know, for the child to return home, whatever that looks like, you know, have to be satisfied and met.
I'm so glad you spoke to that trauma, because as Anita mentioned, a child's best outcome is when they are with their families. And you're right, the foster care system is so important as long as our system is operating the way that it is. But if we're able to find a way to change that, we will need less, and that would be amazing. I think that there's a couple things I wanted to mention, because I'm being told that we have just a few minutes left. That when you named, Anita, that 50% of Black families find themselves surveilled, I don't think we can overstate that. And speaking to how that even coincides with other systems, because one system leads into another. So when you're talking about over surveillance and over policing, can you speak to that?
This is the way. I mean, the policing system is mostly focused on males, and the child welfare system is mostly focused on, you know, women's work, which is family. And so if you look at the parallels, they're all over the place. The other thing is that history in America is to remove children when we don't like the families. Mm-hmm. So the Native American folks, do you know the last year that Native American children were taken from their families only because they were Native American and put into homes, those schools and things? 1973. 1973. They were stripped of their culture, removed sometimes very far away, put in homes, and in Canada they've been finding graves of these children all over the country. So in enslavement, how did we control folks in the plantations? We took their children away. So I understand that sometimes in very rare instances we may need to remove a child, but it should be the rarest thing, not the first thing that we kind of go to, because we have a history of doing this, again, to Native American Black families and even some Latinx families if you go west. So I don't know what your question was, but
no, that's
we
beautiful.
got a history of this stuff, and we got to stop it.
I'm struck by your statement that policing often involves Black males, and the surveillance of the child welfare system also involves the Black females. I don't think I'd ever couched it that way, so thank you for that. One thing that Mahogany mentioned that I think that is something that it's a story that needs to be told as well, is that families find themselves in positions they want to work and so often can't. And the fact that they don't work then is held against them, or it reflects somehow on their character. And then these systems make decisions based on what they see as the character of that family. So I think that it's important, and again, this isn't the child welfare system necessarily, but it bleeds into it. So you have a family that wants to work, and then childcare costs run over $150 a week. And then they lose benefits that look like housing benefits, that look like food, that look like medical care. And there is no step down for that. And so I wonder if that's something that we can speak to. Again, this isn't child welfare specific.
Well, but it is.
But it is.
Yeah, it's the benefits cliff. I mean, and we really, I mean, you know, putting my United Way hat on, we're involved in that, even from a policy perspective. I know on the Kentucky side that there's been a benefits cliff task force that was formed by our elected officials, because I think, you know, honestly, if anything, with COVID really shined a glaring light on this child care situation, right? So when child care centers struggled to stay open, many of them closed. It was already a stretched system that was very fragile to begin with, and COVID compounded that. And again, shined the light, quite frankly, that has been needed to shine on the child care sector, how expensive it is, the access to quality child care that's often lacking. And so I do think, and that has led to even, I think, greater conversations around just what you're describing, that it's often we push families and individuals toward greater economic prosperity. We push them toward, the ability to increase their earned income. But when they do, all of these safety net provisions that are very much needed are washed away. And so, I will say the awareness is there. My hope is that it doesn't become the legislative change, that it doesn't follow the same timeline that we see often with legislative changes that are needed, which are, multi-years to actually get to a place of seeing change. And so that's my hope. I hope to, see something different in that space.
And I'm so thankful that the United Way is having that conversation and that is being brought to the attention of legislatures. But I'm wondering if that's a conversation that we need to have more often among our communities, our community members, families who make a lot of judgments about people who don't work. I feel like that needs to be made.
I think part of the conversation that needs to be had, because I talk about when any chance I get, people throw, they'll say federal poverty levels. No, let's talk about what that is. Because for a family of 4, that is $30,000. Now you look at what the net of that is. I mean, realistically, right? Because everybody has to pay taxes. I mean, so if
those families have to pay taxes.
But I'm just saying. If after taxes, that's probably maybe $22,000 a year. That's less than $2,000 a month. Because I did the math on this. Because that's the people need to understand. So for $1,875 a month for a family of 4, I am expected to pay rent, feed my children, pay for a car, keep insurance, cover clothing, cover utilities, get out of here. And I would love to add another word in that, but that's, so I think breaking it down for people, because when you're in this ecosystem, we use a lot of lingo. I think putting it down and let's talk some just common sense language. Let me tell you what that practically means, and then you tell me how anybody is expected to live on that without the child care benefit, the food benefit, the health care benefit. That is what we need to be screaming. We need to put numbers, and these are real people. It's not stats, what you said earlier. So everybody that's in that income level, these are real people that we are expecting to live like that. Shame on us.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have a question.
Hey, first of all, yes, please break it down in the simple terms for me and my people for us to all understand. My name is Jasmine Harris, and I'm a youth advocate with Play Cousins Collective. I'm also a village ambassador for Play Cousins Collective. I am a housing organizer with the Louisville Tenants Union. I also started my own tenants union first, called the New Directions Tenants Union, and I own a store called Black Market. So I do a lot around food, apartheid as well. My experience, my lived experience has gotten me far. So I feel like I'm here. I feel like y'all preaching to me right now. I seen you the other day, so yeah. And my voice is for the voice of those single mothers. I got 3 children. I had my first one at 17. My mother ended up raising my daughter. She's like, my daughter's like my sister now. And then my 2 little ones. So I haven't always been the best parent. Thanks to Play Cousins, I am the best parent out here. But CPS had got called on me because I didn't have a bed at one time. And I was living in New Directions. My rent was $25. I didn't pay no LG&E. But I was so scared to work because they're going to raise my rent up to possibly $900. And a lot was going on with working and daycare and stuff like that. So I just rather stayed home. So Play Cousins allowed me to take my kids to work. I get to take my kids to work all the time. But there's a lot of different resources out here. But sometimes us as parents, we're scared to go after those resources. Even when I was having a hard time one time, and I asked the resource center to give my children some uniform. And they was like, yeah. And then someone else in the school called CPS on me because I'm utilizing my resource for that day. That's definitely got to stop. But my thing is, for those parents that's out here trying to get those resources who do want to become a better parent, how can you guys, you great people in this room, come to my community, come to my hood without intimidating or I don't want to get my kids taken away or, help us get those resources. New Directions is not just a housing corporation. They're supposed to help families. So when it was ironic that the day before, like a couple of days before, I had an inspection and they noticed I didn't have beds and then CPS got called. And now I'm over here like, oh my God, I need beds and I'm scared because they won't clean my carpets and I need help and I don't know what to do. So when these resources are out here, how can y'all make it to where we're comfortable and reassured that y'all here to help us and not take away our babies?
Thank you for that. First off, I'm going to throw a shout out to Metro United Way again. One of the things that was eye-opening for me to systems is their racial wealth gap simulation. Yes. And if you all have not had an opportunity to go through that simulation, it is eye-opening. Now, I've been through that simulation twice, and every time I still come out emotional, and I know what's coming up and the questions. And as a Black woman, I sit there, and many times thoughts go through my mind. I too was raised by a single Black mother, and how she kept it all together, I don't know, but she did. What I talk about after that simulation are the myths of Black people, Black and brown people, that first of all, we came here as property, okay? So we wasn't even identified as people. We was property that could be traded, sold, given away, whatever that may have been. We was also property to be able to birth babies, to provide for the work of the crops. We also was labeled as not being intelligent, not being innovative. There's being lazy, poor. Through my studies in history, we have been some of the most innovative people. But you also have to look at the time of the era and the systems. Things that we invented, no one would know about that because we were unable to get patents. We were unable to, have the marketing dollars that we needed to put our products out there, or the idea was stolen from us. So coming to you and talking about single parents and resources. First off, I'll go to the hood. I might have my little sparkly shoes on, but I'll come to the hood in my sparkly shoes.
Look at those shoes.
But I think that it's important, as Adria said, that we got to start meeting people where they are and really looking at what they're needing, opposed to, are we always abiding by what the system was there to put in place? Are we really doing the most humane thing for our other citizens in order for them to have optimal life? Are we making it easy for single parents or double parents or whatever to find those resources, and then once again, not setting any type of prejudice? Because I really believe that we do have resources, but as you said, are those resources going to be beneficial to you? Because not one all looks all, and not one all is going to fit all. And so we need to be better of being flexible with individuals that we can see that has the motivation, that wants to do better, but still needs that level of support, just so that I don't let everything else fall through the cracks. And so once again, Metro United Way, I know they have the 211, the 311. There's a lot of resources on there. But again, it's all about who's working within those organizations that's going to provide that extra care for you and says, you know what, this is kind of what I have to do, but let me give you something else. Let me show you something else on this side as well. Because I see that you're trying to do better. And so this may not work for you, what we have lined out, but we, in those areas, in those establishments, we need to know what else out there is available. So if we can't offer it, we can refer you to somebody else, and not only make a referral, but what we need to do is not do a pass off, but we need to make sure that we're handing you off to someone else that is going to take care of you just the way that we would, or if we had the capability of doing within our own organization.
Okay.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
I just have a quick response to your question and as a whole as to what everybody's doing. A lot of this work is based off of relationships. And so if you don't trust me, regardless how I roll up in with resources, like you said, I gotta trust that you ain't gonna betray me and turn me in. So if there's no relationship established, if there's nothing going on, if I'm talking to you on a black and white, I gotta go down my checklist and do my little thing and don't really have the concern for you as a person, then none of this works. I work with students on all levels, and the reason why I'm so effective is because I give them the opportunity. I build up that trust, and once you have that trust, then you can establish anything. So can't just roll up into the hood as a savior. Hey, I'm coming in to save you.
Absolutely not.
We don't get down
Absolutely
like that. Because you coming in, and then what happens when we leave out of there? You right back in the same spot. So I just think it's all about relationships. That's all I gotta say.
And one of the things
Maurice.
that when we're talking about systems, please understand that black and brown people, we've never really had a lot of trust in systems to begin with.
And why should you?
And why would we? Because a lot of times the systems have been working against us and not for us, just for all the reasons that I mentioned before historically. And now we're at a place, and I think too, the Breonna Taylor it really brought a lot of light to Louisville and to the nation about the systems that are out there, policing systems, the educational systems, all those types of things, and they play a part in one into the other. But I will say, in order for us to thrive as a community, it's important for us to embrace each other's diversity. It's important for us to try to understand how we collectively can have a more positive outcome, not just for us, but we have generations after generations that are coming. The one thing that I'm very proud about is those millennials. I've seen more millennials that have gone against the grain for the better good and not worried about if my friends are black or if they Hispanic or they have merged their friendships. And when I look at their friendship collection, it's like a rainbow. And I really think, once again, there's hope, because there's a whole nother group of individuals that are not divided just by the color. There's some of us that are still divided just by the history as to why we can't move forward. And so I love that the millennials are really, being advocates for themselves, and they're pulling all kinds of people together. So I always rally around them that, it's not about the color. It's really about what is working for the families and the children of this nation, of this city, of our state as well.
Thank you so much. I want to respect everyone's time, so I want to name a few things that I've heard. I've heard we need to advocate. We need to advocate. We need to know who our elected officials are, and we need to know how to access those people. We need to make sure that our policies in the places that we sit are culturally appropriate, and that you have people informing those policies who are involved in the lived experience, and that you have people on your board who also are involved in the community and can speak to lived experience. I've also heard disaggregating data. I think that if Kentucky is doing a good job at that, that is amazing. I sat on a infant mortality or a child mortality panel and asked that data, can we speak to poverty level? Can we speak to race? And they didn't have that data. I have no clue how that's the case. But what it was interesting to me is they didn't have the data, but they were like, but let's give all the resources to the people who live below the poverty line. but you don't have the data. So why are we making assumptions? But again, all of that bias that goes into the lawmaking and the legislation. Is there anything else that I have missed that we want to make sure that we leave everyone with as what can we do to bring equity to the system?
You have to keep your foot on the gas. I mean, I know that's a cliched statement, but you can't give up, right? I mean, all of this can feel really overwhelming when you're trying to, move the needle on issues that have been around since the beginning of this nation that feel even more challenging at this moment in this nation. But, if we give up, then what, right? So if anything, it makes me more determined. I'm not going to stop. This is part of the purpose that I have on this earth, is to make a difference in these spaces, and I'm going to keep working as hard as I can to do that. And so I think we just all have to keep that resilience and that determination, and quite frankly, it really is love. When we actually love each other, which is what I believe we are actually here on this earth to do, it shouldn't be as hard as it is, but that's what centers me. I love my fellow man.
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier, just in this field of work, it is overwhelming. You are very tired. Sometimes you have small wins when you want big wins, and you take what you can get sometimes. But I think that it's not a mistake that all three of us are in the spaces where we're supposed to be. I think, for one, because we do speak loud about things that we see that should be opportunities for all and not just for one. One thing, of course, for me is going to be prevention and education. I would like to see us try to invest more into prevention efforts, organizations that are providing prevention work, whether it's being child abuse prevention or gun violence prevention, whatever that may be. We need to invest into those spaces as well. And educating, I tell my staff all the time, I'm never too old to keep learning. And so as long as I'm here on this earth, I'm always open to learning something new that I didn't know before. And even something that I learned before, I may be able to use that knowledge and push something a little bit forward that needs for change. So I think prevention and just continuously educating yourself about what you can do as an individual. I do remember, and I'm going to call her out, Leanne, when I first came into Echo, she's like, "Oh, we're here to save all the children." And I said, "No, ma'am." I said, if the nation hasn't been able to save all the children, I know Sonja can't save all the children, but what Sonja can do is try to save a child one by one. So don't think that what you do always has to be something big and it has to be an accolade and those things. Even the small things can make the huge amount of difference.
So friends, on your table, you'll see some cards that have a QR code. On those cards, you'll be able to register for the upcoming panel discussions. We're going to speak on mental health. We're going to speak on domestic violence. We're going to speak on Black ecosystems and economics. And you also can find our podcast. And I want to highlight, Sonja was able to sit on a podcast with us, and she was able to share so much wisdom. And I feel like this conversation has so much further that we can go. So we may need Anita and Adria to sit with us as well, because we have so much more to say, just not enough time to say it. We are so thankful for you for the time that you gave us today. We hope to see you in continued conversation. And our goal is to never stop talking about these things. The minute that we're silent, the systems that benefit from our silence will rise up and overtake. So we will continue to have this conversation over and over again. Again, we thank you, and we hope that you have a wonderful day.
We are Harper Slade LLC, a racial equity advisory firm. We help companies cultivate an environment where Black and brown talent can thrive and transform workplace cultures. With over 20 years' experience in human resources, employment law, and macroeconomics, our goal is to help advance a true commitment to racial equity. Through education programs, racial equity assessments, and advisory services, we're a global leader and are here to help you make a difference. Visit harperslade.com to learn more.